Dave Grohl was too afraid to be in the same room when Kurt listened to it. He handed over the tape and left. He stood in the hallway and waited. What came back through the door was not what he had prepared himself for, and what happened inside Nirvana in the months that followed was something that nobody, including Dave, had anticipated. It was late 1992, and Nirvana was in the middle of a year that had been, by any external measure, the most successful of their lives, and, by most internal measures, the most disorienting. Nevermind had now sold over 5 million copies in the United States alone. The band had spent most of the previous 14 months on the road, in studios, in interview rooms, in the sustained and relentless exposure that follows an album that changes the shape of what is commercially possible. They were exhausted in the specific way that people become exhausted when the external world is asking far more of them than they have learned to manage. They were also, in their separate ways, trying to maintain some relationship with the thing that had existed before all of this, the music and the reasons for making it. Dave Grohl had been writing songs for years. This was not a secret within the band exactly, but it was also not something he had foregrounded. His role in Nirvana was defined and specific. He was the drummer, and he was extraordinary at it. And the understanding that ran beneath the surface of the band's working life was that Kurt was the songwriter, that the songs came from Kurt, that Dave's contribution was in the execution and the energy and the particular physical force he brought to translating what Kurt had written into something that could hold up in a room of any size. Dave had not challenged this understanding. He had been comfortable inside it, or comfortable enough, in the way that people are comfortable inside arrangements that work even when they also contain something unaddressed. But he had kept writing. In the stretches between tours, in the hours after shows when everyone else was asleep, in the way that someone who has been making music since they were a teenager cannot entirely stop making music just because their formal role within a band does not require it. The songs he was writing were not Nirvana songs. They were something else, louder in some places, melodically different, shaped by influences that ran alongside rather than through the sound Kurt was developing. He was not writing them with any plan. He was writing them because they existed in him and needed somewhere to go. In late 1992, he took a small group of the demos into a studio in Seattle with his friend Barrett Jones, who had been recording bands in the Pacific Northwest for years and whose understanding of what Dave was trying to do was precise and practical. They recorded quickly, without overthinking it. Dave played all the instruments himself, guitar, bass, drums, vocals, which was partly a logistical simplicity and partly something else, the specific freedom of making something that belonged entirely to you, where every decision was yours and every mistake was also yours, and there was no one else's expectation to navigate. The recordings were rough. They were not meant to be released. They were meant to exist, which is a different thing. Kurt found out about the sessions the way Kurt found out about most things, not through any formal disclosure, but through the specific permeability of a world where the same small group of people inhabited the same spaces for long periods of time. Someone mentioned it. Or he heard something. Or he simply noticed, in the way he noticed things, that something was happening that he hadn't been told about. He came to Dave and said he had heard Dave had been recording. He said he wanted to hear it. Dave said yes in the way that people say yes to things they are not sure they are ready for. He handed Kurt a copy of the tape. He said he would come by later. He did not say, "I am afraid of what you will think." He did not say, "I am not sure this changes anything, but I am also not sure it doesn't." He handed over the tape and left. He waited in the hallway outside Kurt's bathroom. Kurt had decided, for reasons that were entirely his own, to listen to the tape in the bath on a Walkman, which was where he listened to music when he wanted to hear it without any part of him managing the experience. Dave stood in the hallway and listened to the silence from the other side of the door and tried not to construct the conversation that was about to happen. The tape ran for several minutes. Dave had no way of knowing which song Kurt was on, whether the thing he was hearing was landing or failing, whether the silence meant engagement or something worse. He stood in the hallway and waited. When the tape ended, the door opened. Kurt was still in the bath. He looked at Dave standing in the hallway and did something that Dave had not remotely predicted. He leaned forward and kissed him on the face. He said he was so excited. He said, "Finally, now I don't have to be the only songwriter in the band." Dave was not sure what to do with this. The response was so completely the opposite of what he had been bracing for. The concern, the territorial instinct, the careful diplomatic management of a situation where one band member had made music that existed outside the band. That it took a moment to process. Kurt was not threatened. Kurt was relieved. The thing Dave had been carrying quietly for months, the songs he had made in the space beside his official role, were not a problem. They were, in Kurt's reading of them, a solution to something he had been carrying himself, the specific loneliness of being the person in a band who writes everything, who generates the raw material that everyone else then brings to life, who carries the creative origination alone. Dave said later, and has said many times since, that he immediately discouraged the idea of the songs going into Nirvana. He said he wanted them kept separate, that they were not Nirvana songs, that Nirvana should keep doing Kurt songs. This is the part of the story that gets less attention than the bathtub kiss, but it is in some ways the more important part. Dave understood, in that moment in the hallway, that what Kurt's response had opened was not a door he wanted to walk through. Not because the songs weren't good enough, and not because he was being modest, but because he understood something about what Nirvana was and what it required, that it ran on Kurt's creative authority the way an engine runs on a specific fuel, and that introducing a second source of that authority, however generously Kurt might receive it in a bathtub on a Tuesday afternoon, would change the chemistry of something that had not yet finished being what it was. So, he said no. He said, keep them separate. Kurt accepted this because Kurt understood it too, even if his immediate instinct had been toward inclusion. He knew what Nirvana was. He knew the difference between generosity in the moment and what a band could actually sustain. But something had changed anyway. Not in the structure of the band, not in who wrote the songs or who played what or how the decision-making worked. Something had changed in the way Kurt saw Dave, and in the way Dave understood his own position within the band, and in the way the two of them moved around each other in the months that followed. Kurt began asking Dave about the songs. Not in a formal way, not in the way that a band conversation about direction sounds when it is being documented, but casually, in the spaces between other things, with a genuine curiosity about what Dave was working on and where the music was going. He was interested in the songs in the way that he was interested in music that he encountered outside of his own making, with a quality of attention that was separate from any calculation about what it meant for Nirvana. He just wanted to know. And Dave found, in the having of these conversations, that something he had been carrying without knowing he was carrying it had been set down. The solo recordings had always existed in a slight tension with his role in the band, not because anyone had named that tension, but because it was there, the gap between what you do officially and what you make privately, which in a band as defined and successful as Nirvana was a gap with some weight to it. Kurt's response in the bathtub had closed that gap. The songs were allowed to exist. They were not a threat. They were not a secret. They were simply something Dave made, and Kurt knew about them, and that knowledge had changed the air between them. The In Utero sessions the following year were different from the Nevermind sessions in ways that have been widely analyzed. The choice of Steve Albini, the deliberate rawness of the production, the songs themselves, which were more angular and more personal and less concerned with accessibility than anything on the previous album. But people who were present during those sessions have also noted something that is harder to quantify, a quality of ease between Kurt and Dave that had not been as consistently present during the Nevermind period. Not comfort exactly, because nothing about making In Utero was comfortable, but something like mutual recognition. Two people who knew what the other was capable of outside the room they were in, and who had decided, consciously or not, to be in the room together anyway. Dave Grohl has been asked hundreds of times about the moment in the hallway, about what it meant to have Kurt hear the demos and respond the way he did. He answers it carefully each time, with the care that he brings to all of his public discussions of Kurt and that period of his life, aware of the weight of the memory, aware of what Kurt became, aware of the distance between the man in the bathtub with the Walkman and the myth that accumulated around him afterward. What he always comes back to is the kiss, not as a sentimental detail, not as the kind of moment that gets preserved in amber and displayed as proof of something, but as a specific and real thing that happened in a specific and real place, a hallway, a bathroom, a Tuesday afternoon in 1992, a tape running on a Walkman in a bathtub in Seattle, a man making music in secret, another man listening without warning, and what passed between them when the tape ended. The relief on both sides, the permission, the fact that the songs were allowed to exist and that their existence changed nothing structurally and everything else. The demos that Kurt heard that afternoon became the foundation of the first Foo Fighters album, released in 1995, 14 months after Kurt was gone. Dave played all the instruments himself, the same as he had in the original recordings. He had no idea if anyone would want to hear it. He made it because the songs existed and because making them was the only available response to a silence that had no other answer. The album sold 8 million copies worldwide. But the first person who heard it, in any form, was a man in a bathtub with a Walkman in Seattle in 1992. He kissed Dave on the face when it was over and said he was so excited. That was the beginning of it. That was where it started. There is a version of the story where Kurt's reaction in the bathtub is the whole story. The funny, humanizing detail, the great man generous in an unexpected moment. That version is not wrong, but it misses what the moment was actually the beginning of. What it was the beginning of was a different kind of trust between two people who had been building something together under conditions that made genuine trust difficult. The speed of the change, the size of the audience, the gap between what they had intended and what the world had decided they represented. Trust under those conditions tends to narrow to the width of what is strictly necessary. The bathtub afternoon widened it, not by much, and not permanently. Nothing about that period was permanent, but enough to matter in the time that was left. People who observed Nirvana during the In Utero sessions have described Kurt as more willing to collaborate than before, less rigidly in control of the outcome. This is attributed mostly to the choice of Steve Albini and his recording philosophy, but it may also be connected to something smaller, the fact that he had listened to what his drummer had made and found it real, and that the reality of it had reminded him he was not the only person in the band with something to offer beyond their official function. This knowledge lived between them for the remaining 2 years of Kurt's life, never formalized, never named, simply there, in the way that things are there when two people have seen something real about each other and chosen not to forget it. Dave Grohl has spent 30 years making music since that afternoon in Seattle. He is asked constantly about Nirvana, about Kurt, about what it was like to be inside something that large and that brief. He answers these questions with the care they deserve. But the answer he keeps coming back to is the small one. The hallway, the tape, the bathroom door, the kiss. The fact that Kurt heard it and was glad. The fact that the songs were allowed to exist. The fact that permission, given once in a specific place by a specific person, was enough to make everything that came after possible.